G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session in the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So thanks for coming along into this session. We're into session 31. We're looking at Jeremiah 48, verse 18, down to Jeremiah 49, verse 6. We're in this section looking at the prophecies against the Gentile nations. We're finished now with Judah. Currently, the nation we're looking at is Moab, Israel's neighbor just to the east on the other side of the Jordan River. It's a part of central Jordan. Moab, this is who we're looking at. It's just who was Moab? Moab was the son of Lot and his eldest daughter. The prophecy against Moab will be completely fulfilled during the tribulation and in the Messianic kingdom. A reason for the judgment against Moab, well, like many, they trusted in their own works and their own treasures and in their god Chemosh. Now, Moab have never been taken into captivity. They have always been free, and they became complacent. And Jeremiah likens them to wine, which has been allowed to settle and become syrupy. It hasn't been decanted. It's just sat there, fat, dumb, and happy. And they believe that nothing could defeat them. And the results of their boasting is that they're going to be laid waste. Moab's mighty men will fail. They'll be slaughtered as a result of God's decree of judgment against them. And just as Israel became ashamed of their worship of the golden calf, because remember, when they were taken into Assyrian captivity, they were idolaters worshiping the golden calf, and they were ashamed because their golden calf couldn't deliver them from the Assyrians. So Moab will also become ashamed of her god, Chemosh, because it can't save them from what's coming either. So we're now moving into the calamity for the cities of Moab. We're going to see this in verses 18 to 25. Verses 18 to 20 are the declaration of the calamity. In verse 18, we have the call to the city of Dibon. O you daughter that dwells in Dibon, come down from your glory and sit in thirst. For the destroyer of Moab is come up against you. He has destroyed your strongholds. Now, Dibon was an important Moabite city that was located north of the Arnon River in the Transjordanian tableland. It's also mentioned in Numbers, quite a bit in Numbers, and in Joshua 13, verse 17. Now, in Jeremiah 48:18, Jehovah declared that the population of Dibon would descend from her glory and sit in thirst. The picture here is that of a nation in need and in a very difficult situation. And the reasons for this are, first of all, the destroyer has come against him. The enemy has arrived and cannot be stopped. Second, he has destroyed Dibon's strongholds. The strongholds of Dibon are no longer there. And then in verse 19, we see a call to another city called Aroer, I-R-O-E-R. O inhabitant of Aroer. Now, this city is mentioned in Joshua 12:2 and Joshua 13:9. Joshua 12:2 and 13:9. And now, concerning this city of Aroer, Jeremiah says to stand by the way and watch. Ask him that flees and her that escapes. Say to them, what has been done? Less than a mile and a quarter southeast from Dibon was this town of Aroer. That's about 2 kilometers, all right? 2 or 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers. Now, it's a Moabite settlement. It's on the north bank of the Arnon River. It had a fortress that guarded the king's highway. And the picture here is that because the city of Dibon was destroyed in verse 18, as her citizens come down from the heights and make their flight from that strategic point, they could stop persons fleeing and ask, what's happened? Why are you fleeing? What has happened? And then in verse 20 is the calamity itself. Moab is put to shame, for it is broken down. Wail and cry, tell ye it by the Arnon, that Moab is laid waste. Now, the Arnon River was a border area for the Moabites. And now, in verses 21 to 24, Jeremiah now lists the cities that will be destroyed. And the passage begins in the first part of 21 with the declaration of judgment on this region. And judgment is come upon the plain country. And this is followed in the second part of 21 down to 24 by a list of 11 cities. We have Holon, Jaza, Mephath, Dibon, Nebo, Beth Diblathain, Kiriathaim, Beth Gamul, Beth Meon, Kerioth, Bozrah, and upon all the cities of the land of Moab, far or near. So these cities are located on the plain or the plateau of Moab. Elsewhere in scripture, there are references to the tableland of Moab. Now, as a person travels from Israel to Moab, he must descend down from Israel into a deep valley and then cross over the Jordan, heading east. On the other side of the eastern Jordan Valley, on the other side begins a very sharp climb into the mountains and hills of Moab. Once on top of it, it opens up into a very flat area known as the Plains Country or the tableland of Moab. Yeah, in these verses here are the cities of the tableland of Moab. This is the same area. Remember, Ruth the Moabitess originated from this area. And Jeremiah mentions 11 cities here. They're the ones we've just come through. Now, what's one of them we're going to look at? Now, there's a city here, Bozrah. This is the Bozrah here of the Moabites is not the same as the Bozrah of the Edomites. This is in the northern. Bozrah is at the northern part of Moab. Edom is south of Moab. Now, the Bozrah of the Moabites is also known as Bezer, B-E-Z-E-R. There it is on your screen, Bezer, and it's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 43. Deuteronomy 4:43, and also Joshua 20, verse 28, 20, verse 28, and 21, verse 36. So after Jeremiah mentions these 11 cities, he concludes in verse 24 by saying, upon all the cities of the land of Moab, far or near, they're going to suffer massive destruction. And in verse 25, he reaches his conclusion for this section. His conclusion is, the horn of Moab is cut off, his arm is broken, says Jehovah. The word horn is used symbolically in the sense of power and authority. And the emphasis here is that the power and authority of Moab is now cut off. His arm is broken. No power left in him. You know, the punishment we're going to see of the pride of Moab in verses 26 to 35 of chapter 48. So having dealt with the destruction of the cities of Moab, the prophecy regarding Moab's judgment now moves on to the nation's pride in verses 26 to 35. And we're going to look at it in two parts. First part, verse 26 to 30, will describe the pride itself, and then verses 31 to 35 will cover its punishment. Okay, the pride. So the very thing that we see here that brought about the fall of Moab was her pride. It's going to be dealt with now. In verse 26, make ye him drunken, for he magnified himself against Jehovah. And Moab shall wallow in his vomit, he also shall be in derision. So what he's saying here, he says here that Moab has magnified himself. He's exalted himself against Jehovah. And the call is to make him drunken so he can drown out his coming sorrow, because it's going to be sorrowful. And the reason he'll experience sorrow is because his pride has caused him to magnify himself against Jehovah. Moab have magnified against Jehovah, and the results will be, first of all, Moab shall wallow in his vomit. Because of his own drunken stupor, he'll wallow in his own vomit. Second, he'll be in derision. While people can respect a man who is a limited drinker and one who drinks in moderation, people look down upon those who become drunk continuously. Moab was held in high respect because of her great wine. But now Moab's wine is going to make her drunk, and she's going to be held in derision she become a laughing stock. And then in verse 27, for was not Israel a derision unto you? Was he found among thieves? For as often as you speak of him, you waggle the head. More to the point is Moab's anti-Semitism. That's what we're seeing here. For was not Israel a derision unto you? Were not Israel and the Jews, what God is saying here, were not Israel and the Jews someone to be poked fun at by the Moabites? The Moabites used the Jews for the same reason as many Gentiles have used them, and that is as a source of mocking. So they mocked the Jews. The Moabites held the Jews in derision. And since the Moabites held the Jews in derision, any curse against God's chosen people will always be returned in kind. So the Moabites are going to be held in derision as well. This principle is based upon Genesis 12, verse 3, the first part of verse 3, where God declared, and I will bless them that bless you, him that curses you will I curse. Then God asks them a question. Was he found among the thieves? He's asking this about Israel and the Jews. Were they found among the thieves, or was Israel caught in the very act of stealing that he was held in such high contempt by the Moabites? That's what he's asking them. Even though Israel was not guilty of stealing, when the Moabites made mention of the Jews, they wagged their heads. They wagged their heads as a sign of contempt. Those Jews, they just laughed at them. They were a joke. This is something that the Moabites may have done, but many Gentiles ever since have done the very same thing. The wagging of the heads against the Jews and holding them in derision and contempt was done by the Moabites and many Gentiles ever since. And it continues today. Now, considering Moab's anti-Semitism, there's a call in verse 28 to forsake the cities of this nation. O ye inhabitants of Moab, leave the cities, dwell in the rock, and be like the dove that makes her nest over the mouth of the abyss. The Moabites were now encouraged to leave their cities and to run for the mountains because the nation is going to be destroyed. And this is because of the anti-Semitism of verse 27 and because of the reasons given right back there in verses 1 to 24, which we looked at in the last session. Now, in verse 29, he deals specifically with the pride of Moab. We have heard of the pride of Moab, that he is very proud, his loftiness and his pride and his arrogancy and the haughtiness of his heart. The pride of Moab is also mentioned by Isaiah in Isaiah 25, verses 10 to 11, and also that's Isaiah 25, 10 to 11, and Zephaniah 2, verses 8 to 11. Moab's pride was actually proverbial in the ancient world. It was something that was very well known. He enumerates the pride of Moab. First of all, it says he's proud. Second, he's very proud. And third, his loftiness is mentioned. And fourth, his pride is mentioned again. And fifth, his arrogance is pointed out. All of these words, pride, very proud, loftiness, pride, and arrogancy, all have similar sounds in the Hebrew text. Jeremiah is using the words at his disposal to make the same point. The term proud, very proud, loftiness, pride, and arrogancy all have similar sounding Hebrew words. So Jeremiah is using here a play on words. And Jeremiah in verse 29 is quoting Isaiah 16, verse 6. Now in verse 30, he spells out the result. I know his wrath, says Jehovah, that is naught. His boastings have wrought nothing. The wrath of Moab, even though it sounds fierce, will prove to be of no avail. All his boastings will prove to be only empty words. It'll be just simply boasting, bragging, nothing more. And to prove his point, in verses 31 to 35, he deals with the punishment of Moab itself. Now in verses 26 to 30, Jeremiah dealt with the pride of Moab. Now in verses 31 to 35, he's going to deal with the punishment of that pride. Verse 31. Therefore will I wail for Moab. Yea, I will cry out for all Moab, for the men of Kir Heres shall they mourn. So verse 31 begins with a lamentation for Moab. I'll wail for her, I'll cry for her. The passage here begins with the term therefore. Remember what it's there for? Therefore here is connecting what follows to the preceding statement about Moab's pride. Because of her pride, therefore, this is going to happen. The subject of the preceding verse was Jehovah. And the verbs in verse 31, the first part of verse 31, are in the first person singular. He says, I will wail, I will cry out. Now, it appears here that it is Jehovah would bemoan Moab because of the judgment, because of the judgment of the nation's insolence and wickedness is going to invoke. So it appears that it is actually Jehovah who will wail and who will cry out. And the reason for the lamentation is the destruction of the cities in verses 31 to 34. First of all, it talks about the men of Kirez shall mourn. The men of Kirez here are also mentioned in 2 Kings 3:25, 2 Kings 3:25, and Isaiah 15:1, Isaiah 15:1, Isaiah 16:7 and 11, 16:7 and 11. Now, Kir Heres is the modern Jordanian city of El Kerak. I believe that there's a fortress at El Kerak. Second, he now turns to mourn for the vine of Sibmah, in verses 32 to 33. With more than the weeping of Jazer will I weep for you. Now, Jazer is mentioned in Numbers 21:32, 2 Samuel, Numbers 21:32, 2 Samuel 24:5. O vine of Sibmah, your branches passed over the sea. They reached even to the sea of Jazer. Upon your summer fruits and upon your vintage, the destroyer is fallen. So the picture here in verse 32 is that the wine of Sibmah, which is a superior wine, remember, Moab was very well known for its wine. Now, while Moab was famous for her wine in general, the wine of Sibmah, Sibmah, was a superior wine. And because of its superiority, it was exported to various places. And because of the destruction of the source of this vine, those who benefited from the wine of Sibmah will now feel the loss themselves. Verse 33 goes on to say, gladness and joy are taken away from the fruitful field and from the land of Moab. He has caused wine to fail from the wine presses. None shall tread with shouting. The shouting shall be no shouting. The picture here is that the massive destruction will not only affect the cities of the Moabites, but also the vines of the Moabites. The very thing that made Moab famous, the very thing that perhaps put Moab on the map, her wine and her wine products, will be totally destroyed. Again, here we have a quotation from Isaiah 16, verses 8 to 10. Remember, Isaiah prophesied well before Jeremiah did. And then third, the cry extends throughout the land in verse 34. From the cry of Heshbon even unto Elilah, even unto Jahaz have they uttered their voice. From Zoar even unto Horonaim to Eglath Shalishah, for the waters of Nimrim also shall become desolate. So from Heshbon to Eliah to Jahaz the cry will extend. The cry that begins in Heshbon will reach all the way to Jahaz. Jahaz is mentioned in Numbers 21:23. These have uttered their voices. The cry also goes from Zoar to Horonaim. So it's pretty much all the borders of the country. Verse 34, from the cry of Heshbon even unto Elilah, unto Jahaz, they uttered their voice. The point here is that the Moabite cities will not only be destroyed on the plain or the tableland where the cities of Heshbon were located, but also further down the slope into the Jordan Valley, all the Moabite cities are going to be destroyed. This area is known as the Arabah or the Jordan Rift Valley. The Arabah or the Jordan Rift Valley. The Moabite cities along the slopes and along the Jordan Rift Valley will also suffer this massive destruction. The Sea of Jahaz, that could be a reference to the Dead Sea itself, because that's on the western side of Moab. Any Moabite cities located along that stretch of territory in the Jordan Rift Valley will also suffer destruction. In verse 35, we have the conclusion of this section. Moreover, I will cause to cease in Moab, says Jehovah, him that offers in the high place and him that burns incense to his gods. So God is going to cause to cease two things in Moab. First of all, the one who offers sacrifice in the high places, and second, the one who offers incense to his gods. All going to cease. Now we see the dirge over Moab in verses 36 to 49. In verse 36, there's a call for instruments that are typically played at funerals. Therefore, my heart sounds for Moab like pipes. My heart sounds like pipes for the men of Kirheres. Therefore, the abundance that he has gotten is perished. The term therefore, once again, connects what follows to the previous section, namely to the description of Moab's destruction. Hebrew term for pipes here is the word chalilim, C-H-A-L-I-L-I-M. It appears twice in this verse. It generally describes a wind instrument, such as a flute, but in this case, it refers to an instrument that in ancient Israel was played to lead dirges, customarily played at funerals. So it's a funeral instrument. Whose heart would moan like a flute for Moab and the population of Kirheres? Gods or the prophets? Well, again, do the emotions of the prophet, this is similar to what we saw previously where it says, I wail, I moan. The question here is this the heart of God or is this the prophet? Or simply do the emotions of the prophet merge with those of Jehovah? Either way, so way look at it, whether it's God or whether it's Jeremiah with his sounding like pipes. All of the wealth, whichever way it is, all of the wealth the Moabites had gained from the export of their superior wine would now be lost. Isaiah 16:11 makes a very similar statement. It says, wherefore my heart sounds like a harp for Moab, and mine inward parts for Kirheres. That's Isaiah. Here in verse 37, for every head is bald and every beard clipped. Upon all the hands are cuttings, and upon the loins sackcloth. Well, he points out here the four signs of mourning for the ancient world. This shows that the devastation is very great. And he points at the four signs of mourning. First, every head is bald, the beards are clipped, hands are cut, which means they cut themselves. And then upon all their loins, we have sackcloth. These are all the signs of mourning. Mourning comes only through devastation of some kind. And in this case, the devastation was brought upon the Moabites. Verse 38 to 39, the picture here is Moab having become a broken vessel. Verse 38 begins with a lamentation. The lamentation is everywhere. On all the housetops of Moab and in the streets thereof, there is lamentation everywhere. For I've broken Moab like a vessel wherein none delights, says Jehovah. The reason for the lamentation is because I have broken Moab like a vessel wherein I am delighted. So Moab is like a bottle or a vessel which is overly used and cracked or shattered, so it was of no further use. Jehovah simply smashed Moab like an unwanted vessel. And in verse 39, the results are, how is it broken down? How do they wail? How has Moab turned the back with shame? So shall Moab become a derision and a terror to all that are round about him. First of all, we see it's broken down. Second, they shall not be wailed. Third, Moab has turned their back with shame. The picture here is that Moab has fled in shame rather than standing and fighting. The picture is that Moab has become a derision and a shame to all who are around her. All that God has decreed will come to pass. She who derided others will now become a derision herself. So the doom of Moab is now given in verses 40 to 46, where Jeremiah continues with his words of judgment. In verses 40 to 42, the totality of the destruction is emphasized. In verse 40, we have the figure of the eagle. For thus says Jehovah, behold, he shall fly as an eagle and shall spread out his wings against Moab. The one who flies like an eagle is the enemy of Moab, whom God will send to carry out his destruction. The picture here is that the invading army will be like an army flying on a huge eagle with its wings spread out, and the shadow from these wings of this invading army will cover the entire nation of Moab. Therefore, Moab will be destroyed. The person represented by the eagle is not identified here in this context, but it is Nebuchadnezzar, which we know, because the same metaphor of the eagle of an eagle for this man in this country is found in Ezekiel 17 verses 3 to 5. Ezekiel 17 verses 3 to 5. In verse 41, Kerioth is taken and the strongholds are seized. And the heart of the mighty men of Moab at that day shall be as the heart of a woman in her birth pangs. So this invasion is going to create the fear of the mighty. The mighty boastings of the Moabites that was given earlier in chapter 48, verse 14, will prove to be nothing but hot air. They'll develop fear and a sense of cowardice amongst the mighty men of Moab. The hearts of these mighty men should be like the heart of a woman in her birth pains. In verse 42, the emphasis here is upon the totality of the judgment. Moab shall be destroyed from being a people. The reason is because he has magnified himself against Jehovah. So this arrogance against Jehovah would lead to the total destruction of the nation. The Moabites disappeared as a people as a result of a later invasion by the Arabs and the Nabateans. As we learned earlier in this chapter, Moab magnified himself against Jehovah in two ways. First of all, they believed in the superiority of their god Chemosh. Second, they derided God's people, Israel. And this is why they themselves will be brought down and will be derided. In verses 43 to 44, the emphasis here is upon the inescapability of the destruction. Earlier on, the totality of the destruction was emphasized. Now the inescapability of the destruction is now pointed out. In verse 43, fear and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of Moab, says Jehovah. He uses the figure here of the fear, pit, and snare. In the Hebrew text, these are what they call assonant sounds, and they all have similar sounding patterns. Fear is pashad, pit is pashat, and snare is pash. So the picture here is a bit of a play upon words. Now he also quoted here, Jeremiah also quoted here, Isaiah 24, verses 17 to 18, which states, fear and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of the earth. It shall come to pass that he who flees from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit. He that comes up out of the midst of the pit shall be taken in the snare. And in Isaiah, in Isaiah 24, Isaiah applied it to Israel, but in this situation, it's now applied to the Moabites. And then in verse 44, first part of verse 44, this destruction is inescapable. He that flees from the fear shall fall into the pit. He that gets up out of the pit shall be taken in the snare. The one who manages to flee from fear will fall into the pit. One who manages to escape from the pit will be taken in the snare. And this is a quotation of Isaiah 24, verse 18. Verse 44b, the second part, spells out the cause of this judgment. For I'll bring upon him, even upon Moab, the year of their visitation, says Jehovah. The cause once again is God himself. God will bring upon Moab the year of her visitation. Now, the phrase, the year of visitation, only occurs in Jeremiah, and we see it in Jeremiah 11, verse 23, 23:12, and 48:44. Jeremiah 11:23, 23:12, and 48:44. It's used now throughout the Old Testament in the sense of a special time of judgment. Jehovah declared that this judgment would come because he's going to bring it on. The year of visitation, special judgment coming. Verses 45 to 46 tells the results of this destruction. First of all, concerning the escapees or refugees of Moab, verse 45, they that fled stand without strength under the shadow of Heshbon. For a fire has gone forth out of Heshbon, and a flame from the midst of Sihon, and hath devoured the corner of Moab and the crown of the head of the tumultuous ones. The picture here is that the fire originates within the cities of the Moabites. The fire destroys the cities, and it reaches out and destroys the surrounding territories. The sin of Moab brings about their destruction. Their sin of pride in particular will be judged. The sin of anti-Semitism will also be judged. So the cause of their destruction is their sin, and this sin lies within the Moabites themselves. Sin always carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The fire begins with the cities because that is where the sin is located. Eventually, it moves out and destroys the entire surrounding territories. Then verse 45 quotes from the prophecies against Moab, which is found in Numbers 21, verse 28, and Numbers 24, verse 17. Numbers 21, verse 28 reads, For a fire is gone out of Heshbon, a flame from the city of Sihon. It has devoured Ar of Moab, the lords of the high places of the Arnon. Then Numbers 24:17 adds, this is very interesting when we look at this. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not nigh. There shall come forth a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite through the corners of Moab, and break down all the sons of tumult. Now, this is Numbers 24:17. This makes a very interesting statement regarding the destroyer of Moab. For it notes that the nation would be crushed by a star out of Jacob and a scepter that would come from Israel. Now, in the greater context of Numbers chapters 22 to 24, this records the oracles of the Gentile astrologer and seer, Balaam. During a time in the Exodus, when the Israelites arrived on the border of Moab and were about to enter the promised land, this was when Balaam entered the scene. The king of Moab, which is what we're dealing with today, the nation of Moab, was Balak. He was one of the early anti-Semites of history. He took objection to the prospect of new neighbors and decided to act. So what he did was he called for Balaam and commissioned him for a considerable amount of money to come and curse the Jews. Balaam tried hard to fulfill his commission, but every time he opened his mouth to pronounce curses, God took control of his tongue, and the seer found himself blessing the Jews instead. Now, in the fourth of the oracles of Balaam, which we see here in the context of Jeremiah 48:45, it pertains to this here because it contains the key prophecy of Numbers 24:17. What Balaam said was that a star would come forth from Israel. Now, this star is paralleled by a scepter. This is Numbers 24:17. And the star and scepter both come from the same nation. Now, remember, scepters always represent kingship. You can find that in Genesis 49, verse 10. This is where Jacob blesses his sons. This unique and powerful Jewish king, whose arrival would be announced by a star, would smite through the corners of Moab. So apparently, the punishment spelled out in Jeremiah 48 would be carried out by the Messiah, the King of Israel, at his second coming. Second thing we see here is that Moab is going to go into captivity. Verse 46. Earlier we learned that Moab was like the one who had settled upon his lees in her complacency. While they suffered invasion and subjugation, Moab never suffered captivity or exile. But now Moab will suffer captivity and exile. Woe unto you, O Moab! The people of Chemosh is undone, for thy sons are taken away captive and thy daughters into captivity. This is a quotation from Numbers 21:9. Numbers 21:9. Now, as we look at these passages of judgment, out of 47 verses found in Jeremiah 48, the first 46 verses have dealt with the various judgment for the sins of Moab. How was all this fulfilled? Well, several points here. First of all, Moab was taken into captivity by Babylon, same as Judah was taken into captivity. So the Moabites were also taken into captivity. After the Moabites were taken into captivity, their territory was then heavily settled by the Nabateans. The Nabateans were one of the Arab tribes. Now, later on, much later on, in the Byzantine period, it was settled by more Arab tribes. So, first of all, taken into captivity. Second, Balaam's complete prophecy, which we just looked at in Numbers 24, concerning Moab, was reiterated by Jeremiah 48. It's going to find its full fulfillment only in the tribulation and at the second coming. Portions of Jeremiah 48 have been fulfilled by the Babylonian captivity and the subsequent settlement of the country by the Nabateans and other Arabs. However, full fulfillment remains for the tribulation and the second coming. Although the first 46 verses Jeremiah has been dealing with judgment, the final verse of Jeremiah chapter 48 ends with a word of hope. There is hope for Moab. Now, Moab going into captivity in verse 46, we learned, I think I've done that before. Okay, now Moab is going to suffer captivity and exile. Woe unto you, O Moab! The people of Chemosh is undone, for thy sons are taken away captive and thy daughters into captivity. This is a quotation of Numbers 21:29. Now, as we look at these passages of judgment, we see that we've dealt with, we said the first 47 verses in Jeremiah 48. Yeah, told you that before. Now, how was all this fulfilled? Well, Moab was taken into captivity by Babylon in 582 BC, same as Judah was in 586 BC. But her complete prophecy won't be fulfilled until the second coming of Messiah. Now, what we see here is that today Moab is now part of Jordan, yeah, and this this is the Trans-Jordan area. This is where she is today. I've doubled up in a lot of stuff here. Okay, I think I've doubled up with that entire. Okay, let's get on to verse 47. Yet I will bring back the captivity of Moab in the latter days, says Jehovah. Thus far is the judgment of Moab. The restoration of Moab is now given in verse 47, and this deals with the final future restoration of Moab. Yet I will bring back. So once again, Jeremiah uses his favorite word here, shuv, S-H-U-V. Now, the latter days, it says in the latter days are the time of the kingdom or messianic period. Rabbinic theology agrees that the verse refers to the days of the Messiah. According to Rabbi David Kimchi, these are much earlier rabbis, the Moabites would return to their land in the days of the Messiah, meaning in the messianic era. Yerushalmi, another Jewish rabbi, earlier Jewish rabbi, agrees with this teaching, and he adds that the phrase at the end of days is always assumed to refer to the days of the Messiah. Moab will be restored. Moab will be a kingdom during the 1,000-year kingdom of Jesus Christ. Jeremiah points out that this is the conclusion as far as the judgment of Moab is concerned. Thus far is the judgment of Moab. And with this promise of restoration, the prophecies against Moab end. Now we move on to Ammon. Now, chapter 49, 1-6 is Ammon. This nation was located north of Moab in the middle of the Transjordanian Plateau. It's northeast of the Dead Sea, so it's over to the right of the Dead Sea between the Arnon and Jabbok rivers. We have its capital, Rabba Ammon, same as today. It's Amman, the capital of Jordan today. Now, the nation of Ammon had a very complicated and often negative history with Israel. According to Genesis, this is just some history. According to Genesis 19, 36 to 38, the progenitor of the Ammonites was Ben-Ami, the offspring of Lot's incestuous union with his younger daughter. Since Lot was a nephew of Abraham, the Ammonites and the Israelites were actually blood relatives. And by the time of the Judges, Ammon had become an aggressive military state and had joined forces with the Moabites and the Amalekites to conquer the territory of Transjordan that belonged to Israel and had been allotted to the tribe of Gad. So border struggles were common between Israel and Ammon until David subdued the land. And in 734 BC, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III deported the people of Gad, which is the Jews, when he put down a revolt by Israel, and then Ammon took over Gad's territory. Ammon also exerted religious influence over Israel. Solomon, for instance, took Ammonite women for wives, including his son Rehoboam's mother, Naamah. And these foreign women also promoted the worship of Molech, an Ammonite god, throughout Israel. So under the influence of this nation, Israel rejected God and actually embraced idolatry. Yeah, it's just a little burst about Ammon. This just gives a bit of a past history to show that in virtually every period of Israel's history, Ammon's land and people have played a very significant role. In general, prophecies against Ammon were those of judgment. Now, we're going to look at the destruction of Ammon in verses 1 to 5. In verses 1 to 6 is a judgment, but 1 to 5 is the destruction itself. Now, the basis of the judgment is in verses 1 to 2. Now, as he deals now with God's destruction of the Ammonites, verses 1 and 2 deal with the basis of God's judgment against them. In verse 1, the first part of verse 1 is the topic. It says, the Ammonites were also the subject of prophetic scripture. Now, verse 1, it says, of the children of Ammon, their chief sin is the possession of Jewish territory. Thus says Jehovah, has Israel no sons? Has he no heirs? This is what God is asking Ammon. If Israel had no sons or heirs, then it would have been acceptable for the Ammonites to take over Jewish territory because there would have been no Jewish owners for it. So God is asking, virtually saying, why have you taken over the land belonging to the Jews? Has she no sons? Has she no heirs? Of course she does. So Ammon went in there illegally. There were Jews. Israel had sons and heirs. And the result was that Ammon was possessing territory owned by the Jews. Why then, he goes on to ask, why then does Malcham possess Gad? Gad, that's the Jewish tribe, and his people dwell in the cities thereof. Now, he's just asking, why are you possessing the land that was given to the tribe of Gad? Now, the term Malcham might actually mean Molech the king. Molech is the Ammonite term for the king. Molech was also the national god of the Ammonites, same as Chemosh was the national god of the Moabites. Molech is the national god of the Ammonites. The name Malcham refers to Molech, the god of the Ammonites. This god is also mentioned in Leviticus 18:21. They're on your screen there. Leviticus 20, verse 2 to 5, 1 Kings 11:5, 7:33, and 2 Kings 23:10. Now, Malcham or Molech is now viewed as having possessed Jewish territory. His people dwell in the cities thereof. So his people, or the Ammonites, are dwelling in territory which rightfully belonged to the tribe of Gad, which was one of the 12 Jewish tribes. And verse 2 points out that in light of Ammon's conquest of Israelite territory, punishment must come. Therefore, behold, the days come, says Jehovah, that I will cause an alarm of war to be heard against Rabbah of the children of Ammon. It shall become a desolate heap, and her daughters shall be burned with fire. Then shall Israel possess them that did possess him, says Jehovah. For the 12th time in Jeremiah, Jehovah used the phrase, the days come, to indicate that what he was about to say would take place in the prophetic future. In that future, he would cause a trumpet blast to go out against Rabbah. The town of Rabbah was the capital of the Ammonites. It is the modern-day city of Amman in Jordan. Amman is the same city that was previously known as Rabbah. Now, Amman is still on the divine judgment. It shall become a desolate heap. Hebrew term for heap, which is tel, means a mound. The word is often used to describe an ancient ruin. So according to this prophecy, Rabbah, or current-day Amman, would become a ruin. Furthermore, the towns of Amman would also be set on fire. And the result of this judgment on Amman is another example of the principle that a curse against Israel will be returned with a curse in kind. Then shall Israel possess them that did possess him. So the Israelites would regain the territory that the Ammonites had taken from them. And in verses 1 to 5, he deals with the destruction of Ammon. Verses 1 to 2, the basis of the judgment. Verses 3 to 5, he now gives the judgment itself. Verse 3 contains another lamentation. Wail, O Heshbon, for Ai is laid waste. Cry, ye daughters of Rabbah, gird you with sackcloth, lament and run to and fro among the fences. Now Heshbon should wail because Ai is plundered. That's Ai, is plundered. The daughters of Rabbah, the capital, should cry. They should show their lamenting by girding themselves with sackcloth. And the reasons for their lamenting are, Malcham shall go into captivity, his priests and his princes together. So first, Malcham or Molech, the god of the Amorites, shall go into captivity, just as Chemosh, the god of the Ammonites, the Moabites, went into captivity back in Jeremiah 48:7. Second, not only will Malcham go into captivity, but the priests and the princes will also go into captivity together. Verse 4 shows that one result of this punishment would be a cessation of boasting. Wherefore glory you in the valleys, your flowing valley, O backsliding daughter, that trusted in her treasures, saying, who shall come unto me? The addressee is Ammon, backsliding daughter. Shuv, there's Jeremiah's favorite word again. In her rebellion, she who trusted in her treasures and she who boasted in her might, saying, is there anyone who would ever dare to come against me? She's going to cease from boasting. Indeed, someone would come and someone would destroy her. In verse 5, the reason for the lamentation of verse 3, the reason for the cessation of boasting in verse 4 is because, behold, I will bring a fear upon you, says the Lord Jehovah of hosts, from all that are round about you, and you shall be driven out every man right forth, and there shall be none to gather together the fugitives. So first of all, the Ammonites will be surrounded by panic and terror. God will bring a fear upon all who are round about her. They'll be overwhelmed with panic. And second, they're going to be driven out. They'll be driven and dispersed. Third, they'll be so dispersed that no one will be able to gather them. No one. However, as with the Moabites, the passage now ends with a restoration of hope. 49 verse 6. But afterward, after all this, I'll bring back the captivity of the children of Ammon, says Jehovah. The restoration of Ammon is given in verse 6. Just as God promised a restoration of Egypt back in 46 verse 26, and the Moabites in 48 verse 47, he also promised that Ammon would be restored. As for the timing of this restoration, it would take place afterward, meaning what? After the punishment that, according to verse 2, would occur in the prophetic future. So once the punishment was completed, the nation would be restored. And as a result, there will be a saved nation called Ammon in the Messianic kingdom. The people of this kingdom will be in a subservient position to the nation of Israel. Next, we're going to see that Jeremiah is going to turn to the third Transjordanian nation, the Edomites, and he's going to deal with the Edomites in verses 7 to 22 of chapter 48. But this is where we're going to finish it off for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.